The white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, and floral arrangements of scarlet and cream roses created a fairy tale atmosphere that Lauren Parker had imagined 1,000 times, but the reality exceeded all expectations. This day was to be the beginning of a new life, the same one she'd dreamed of since she'd first met Thomas Harrison at the town library 2 years ago. The couple Thomas Harrison and Lauren Parker twirled in the spotlight, their first dance as husband and wife. The eyes of the guests were fixed on them, phones raised to capture the perfect moment. Many of those in attendance noticed how odd the couple looked against the backdrop of Prim Oak Ridge with its traditions. She, a simple librarian who came from nowhere, and he, the heir to the Harrison construction empire, the unspoken kings of the county. Lauren looked dazzling in a cream satin dress with fine lace. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elegant coiffure with fresh flowers, her greenish-brown eyes shining with happiness. Thomas, a tall brown-haired man in a classic black tuxedo, kept his eyes on her as if he couldn't believe his happiness. "She's a real beauty," one of the Harrison aunts whispered to a neighbor. "Though the nose is a little big, don't you think? And the shoulders, pretty broad for a girl." "As long as she has healthy children," she replied with a meaningful nod. "James needs grandchildren, especially after that Elizabeth thing." Off the dance floor, at the head table, sat the groom's father, James Harrison, his large face with a protruding chin, usually radiating confidence and authority, now seemed carved from stone. Through smoothly slicked back hair, touched with gray, tanned skin shone through. The expensive suit was impeccable, but it couldn't hide the physical strength that remained despite his 61 years. He mechanically raised the crystal champagne glass when his wife Elizabeth, an elegant woman in a lavender-colored dress, with tired eyes and a fine string of pearls around her neck, whispered something to him. The waltz melody reached a climax. Thomas kissed Lauren tenderly, eliciting applause from the guests. The world around them was filled with music, flowers, and smiles. But suddenly James Harrison's phone vibrated silently in the breast pocket of his jacket. He looked at the screen and his face froze, as if seeing something no one else saw. 3 seconds stretched into an eternity. James rose slowly, never taking his eyes off the dancing couple. His hand slid under his jacket, where no one would expect to find a gun at a wedding reception. But there it was, a black pistol, compact and deadly. The gunshot sounded like the pop of a champagne cork, but everyone knew at once it wasn't part of the festivities. Lauren froze in Thomas's arms, her eyes widening in surprise and pain. A scarlet stain began to spread across the cream satin, turning the airy dream into a heavy nightmare. Thomas didn't immediately realize what was happening. He continued to hold Lauren, even as her knees buckled and her head fell back involuntarily. His arms, which only moments ago had gently encircled his wife's waist, were now trying to keep her from falling, becoming clammy with blood. "Lauren?" His voice sounded confused, like a little boy's. "Lauren, look at me!" The screams of the guests merged into a cacophony of terror. Some called the police, others tried to administer first aid, but all actions were in vain. The bullet had struck her heart, ending Lauren Parker Harrison's life 23 minutes after she had said, "I do." James Harrison stood motionless, the gun still pointed toward his son's fiancée. His face expressed neither remorse nor anger, only the cold determination of a man who had done the necessary work. "Dad!" Thomas finally shouted, lifting his gaze from Lauren's lifeless body. "What have you done? What have you done?" James slowly lowered the gun, as if only now realizing he was still holding it. He didn't answer his son, just returned to his seat at the table, placing the gun in front of him. The cops arrived 7 minutes after the call, filling the Magnolia restaurant with blue flashers and sharp commands. By then, James was already sitting motionless, waiting for them. He did not resist arrest, silently allowing himself to be handcuffed and led out of the room. James's face remained impassive, only something remotely resembling sadness flashed in his eyes as he passed his son. Thomas was still holding Lauren's body, refusing to believe what was happening. His snow-white shirt and tuxedo were soaked in his bride's blood, and a look of absolute shock lingered in his eyes. He didn't cry. The tears would come later. Right now, his mind refused to accept reality. "I'm Detective Alexa Morgan," a woman in a strict anthracite-colored suit introduced herself. arriving 30 minutes after the patrol officers. Her short brown hair was tucked behind her ears, her brown eyes scrutinizing the crime scene through thin-rimmed glasses. The chaos was slowly gaining structure under her direction. Forensic scientists were working the body, photographing the crime scene, gathering evidence. Witnesses, guests in festive attire, waited their turn to testify. Police tape cordoned off the crime scene, turning the wedding party into a scene of tragedy. "We all saw it happen," Thomas's friend, Jeremy Fox, a tall blonde man with reddened eyes, said in a shaky voice. "James just stood up and fired a shot. No warning, no yelling, didn't say a word. It was like an execution." Morgan nodded, making notes in her notebook. "Did you notice anything unusual before the gunshot? Any detail could be important." He looked at his phone, recalled one of the bridesmaids, a young woman in a pastel pink dress. Then his face changed. It was like he made a decision. You know, that's the face a person makes when they've crossed some internal line. "He and Lauren haven't clashed before?" Morgan asked, shifting her gaze from the notebook to the girl. "Maybe there were some tense moments that you noticed?" "No, not at all." The maid of honor splashed her hands. "James has always been very polite to her. Cold, maybe, but no more so than with everyone else. He is, after all, such an unapproachable man." How did Thomas feel about his father? "He idolized him," Jeremy answered quietly. "Always strove to live up to expectations. You know, the classic story, the son who can never please the demanding father." Detective Morgan methodically questioned the guests, building up a picture of what had happened. All the testimony was consistent. No arguments before the wedding, no signs of impending tragedy. Just that moment with the phone that several witnesses had noticed. "Where's Thomas?" Morgan asked the young officer with the clipboard after 2 hours of questioning. "In the next room with the medics. He's in shock." Morgan found her fiancé sitting on a couch in the staff lounge, with a blank stare and bloody hands. A nurse was trying to treat a scratch on his cheek that had appeared from some unknown source, but he didn't seem to notice anything. Lauren's veil lay on a table nearby. Somehow he'd kept it, a fragile symbol of a shattered dream. "Mr. Harrison," Morgan began softly, taking a seat across from him. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I know it's unbearably hard, but I need to ask some questions to understand what happened." Thomas slowly raised his head. There were no tears in his eyes, only emptiness. His lips, usually curved in a slight smile, now seemed stiffened. "Did your father have any reason to disapprove of your marriage?" Morgan asked, trying to speak as delicately as possible. "Perhaps some disagreement we should know about?" Thomas shook his head slowly, furrowing his brow as if the question required an incredible effort to understand. "He gave us his blessing, paid for the wedding, everything. Everything was fine. He gave Lauren a family brooch for the engagement, said she was worthy of becoming a Harrison. Have you noticed any changes in his behavior lately? Maybe he's become more withdrawn, anxious, irritable?" "No, nothing." Thomas squeezed the veil in his hands, his fingers leaving reddish marks on the white fabric. "He was himself, demanding, collective, controlled every detail of the wedding, but it's just his style. And the message? Your father got the message before—" Morgan didn't finish the sentence, not wanting to make Thomas relive the moment of the gunshot yet again. "I don't know," Thomas replied quietly, his gaze going blank again. "I don't understand. Why did he do it? Why Lauren? What did she do to him?" Morgan put her hand on Thomas's shoulder, feeling it shiver beneath the thin fabric of the ruined tuxedo. "We'll find out, I promise. Your father will be held accountable for his actions." "She's been my whole life," Thomas said in a voice so quiet that Morgan had to lean in to hear. 2 years. 2 years of absolute happiness. And now... He didn't finish the sentence, just sat there, clutching his veil and staring into the void, and Morgan realized that any words of comfort now would sound false. She left her business card next to him and quietly walked out, nodding to the nurse not to leave him alone. Meanwhile, at the police station, James Harrison was led into the interrogation room, a featureless room with gray walls, a metal table, and a CCTV camera in the corner. He sat quietly, waving his lawyer, arms folded in front of him as if in a business negotiation, but answered all questions about motives in the same way. I'm not going to discuss it. Do you realize you've been seen by dozens of witnesses? Officer Ray Johnson, an older African-American man with a streak of gray in his short-cropped hair, leading the initial questioning, asked, "There's no point in denying it. All the evidence is against you." "I don't deny it," James replied in a level voice, squaring his shoulders. "I killed her. That's a fact. I'm not going to waste your time denying the obvious." "Why?" Johnson asked bluntly, looking Harrison Sr. in the eye. What made a respected businessman, a pillar of society, shoot his own son's fiancée on her wedding day? "I will not discuss it," James repeated, enduring the officer's stare with the ease of a man accustomed to tough negotiations. "My reasons will remain my reasons. Your son just lost his wife, Mr. Harrison, on his wedding day at the hand of his own father. Don't you think he deserves an explanation?" A shadow of emotion ran across James's face. "Thomas will understand in time." Detective Morgan returned to the station late in the afternoon when it was already dark outside the interrogation room windows. After reviewing the videotape of the interrogation, she decided to try a different approach. A calm, no-pressure approach that she could see wasn't working on James Harrison. "Mr. Harrison," she began, entering the room and closing the door carefully behind her, "we checked your phone, the very message you received before you pulled out your gun." For the first time all evening, James looked worried. His gaze grew sharper, and his fingers, which had been resting calmly on the desk until then, twitched slightly. "You don't have a warrant. My phone is private property." "You're right, but we have witness statements about a message you received just before the murder. The message that caused you to pull out a gun and shoot your son's fiancée. It's key evidence, and the judge will sign the warrant before dawn," Morgan bluffed, watching James's reaction carefully. James remained silent, but his fingers clenched slightly, giving away his inner tension. "What was in that message, Mr. Harrison?" Morgan asked softly, leaning forward. "What could have been so horrible as to cause you to ruin your own son's life?" "I will not discuss it," he repeated for the fourth time, but there was no longer the same firmness in his voice. Morgan changed tactics. "Your wife told us about your obsession with your family tree, about how important the continuation of the Harrison family is to you." It elicited a reaction, barely noticeable, but Morgan noticed the way James's shoulders tensed and his gaze darted away for a split second, as if looking for non-existent support. "Elizabeth doesn't know anything," he finally said, and there was a note of weariness in his voice. She never understood. After several hours of fruitless attempts, Morgan decided to take a break. After obtaining a search warrant for Harrison's home and office, she went to his mansion on the outskirts of town, a 3-story Georgian-style house surrounded by manicured gardens and a wrought iron fence with a monogrammed X on the gate. The elegant house with white columns reflected the status of one of Oak Ridge's most influential families. Elizabeth Harrison met the detective in the living room, where the honeymoon gifts were still spread out, boxes in holiday wrapping, and envelopes with cards that no one would now read. "I don't understand," Elizabeth said quietly, clutching a handkerchief in her hands. He was never a cruel man. Demanding, yes, sometimes even ruthless in business. But this, Mrs. Harrison, your husband received a message before he did the deed. Do you have any idea who it might have been from?" Elizabeth shook her head, and the light from the floor lamp brought out the gray strands in her neatly styled hair. "James works hard. He has hundreds of business contacts. He never discusses work matters with me." "How did he feel about Lauren? Honestly, Mrs. Harrison, that's important." "Good," Elizabeth replied uncertainly, rubbing the pearl necklace around her neck. At least it seemed that way. He was glad Thomas had finally decided to settle down. Finally? "Thomas is 29, James. He always talked about the importance of family, the continuation of the Harrison family." Elizabeth looked away. Maybe he did too often, especially after it became clear that we couldn't have more children. While the other officers methodically searched the house, Morgan continued her conversation with Mrs. Harrison, trying to understand the dynamics of this family. Elizabeth spoke evasively, but between the lines she could read a lot. An overbearing husband who controlled every aspect of life, a son who always strove to meet his father's expectations, and herself a quiet shadow beside the men of the family. "Detective!" called one of the officers from James's office on the second floor. "You might want to take a look at this. We found something interesting." In the drawer of the massive oak desk, under a stack of business papers, was a folder labeled LP, Lauren Parker's initials. Morgan opened it and froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. Inside were surveillance photos, some documents, personal information, a whole dossier on Thomas's fiancée. On the first page was the logo of Southern Investigations, a private detective agency, and the signature, "Confidential Report for J.H." "He's been following her," Morgan muttered, flipping through the pages. But why? What was he looking for? The morning after the tragedy was overcast, as if nature itself was mourning what had happened. Detective Alexa Morgan stood in front of the unremarkable two-story house on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, where Lauren Parker rented a small apartment. Yesterday's events seemed like some kind of nightmare, but the folder with the Southern Investigations logo now lying in her briefcase was very real. "Are you sure you want to attend?" Morgan asked, turning to Thomas Harrison, who was standing nearby. His eyes were red from a sleepless night, and his face was frozen with the expression of a man who still couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. "I must," he answered quietly. "Whatever the police have found, I have to know the truth." Morgan nodded and turned the key in the lock, the spare they'd found in Lauren's purse. The door opened easily, and they entered the small but cozy apartment. Everything breathed Lauren's presence. The pictures on the walls, the books neatly arranged on the shelves, the fresh flowers in a vase on the kitchen table. A life interrupted halfway through. "I've never been here before," Thomas said, running his hand along the bookshelf. "We always met at my place or in public places. Lauren said her apartment was too small and uncomfortable." Morgan watched his reaction carefully. "She never invited you over to her place, in a 2-year relationship?" Thomas shook his head, looking thoughtfully at the picture of him and Lauren standing against the ocean. "No, I never insisted. Thought she had a right to her personal space. I realize now how little I knew about her." The detective began a methodical search of the apartment. 2 uniformed officers assisted her, carefully going through Lauren's belongings, photographing and describing the findings. There was nothing unusual in the living room, bedroom, and bathroom. Clothes, cosmetics, personal items as one would find on any 24-year-old woman. "Check the bookshelves," Morgan ordered. "Often people use books as hiding places. And don't forget the mattress. There may be secret pockets in there." Thomas stood in the middle of the living room, looking around confused. "I don't understand. What do you hope to find here?" Morgan paused, weighing how much to tell. "At your father's house, we found a file of private investigation files on Lauren. He's been following her." Thomas's face contorted with anger and pain. "Why?" She was perfect, smart, caring, beautiful. My father told me himself that I made the right choice." "We're trying to find out," Morgan replied softly, watching one of the officers carefully tapping the walls looking for hiding places. "Detective, there's something in here," a young officer called out from the bedroom. He pointed to a small safe hidden in the back of a closet behind a stack of sweaters. "Did you know about this safe?" Morgan asked, turning to Thomas. The man shook his head, stepping closer. "No. Never seen it before. We'll need a warrant to open it," the officer began. But Thomas had already knelt down in front of the safe. "Try the day we met," he said, turning to the digital panel. "September 3rd, 2022. He dialed the combination, 0309222. The safe didn't open. "Maybe her birthday?" Morgan suggested. "May 21st, 2001. Thomas dialed a new combination, 210501. The lock clicked and the safe door opened. Inside was a stack of documents and plastic files, a few photographs, and a small jewelry box. Thomas reached for the papers, but Morgan gently intercepted his hand. "Let me go first," she said, putting on latex gloves. She carefully pulled out the papers and began looking through them. A birth certificate in the name of Lawrence Parker, dated May 21st, 2001. Medical records with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Name change papers. Prescriptions for hormone therapy. Surgeon's reports. Morgan slowly raised her gaze to Thomas, who stood frozen in anticipation. "Thomas," she began cautiously, "did you know that Lauren—" "What?" His voice trembled. "Lauren was born a man. These documents show that she underwent a sex change process about 6 years ago." Thomas staggered as if from a physical blow. His face paled, his eyes widened in disbelief. "No, that's impossible. I would have known. I would have felt—" "Have a seat." Morgan pointed to the bed. "This is complex information." Thomas lowered himself to the edge of the bed, keeping his eyes on the documents in the detective's hands. "Show me," he demanded. Morgan handed him the birth certificate. Thomas stared at it for a long moment, and then slowly shifted his gaze to the photographs that had also been removed from the safe. One of them showed a teenager with facial features vaguely reminiscent of Lauren, but with short hair and wearing men's clothes. "I don't understand," he whispered. "We've been together for 2 years. We're close. How could I not know?" "Modern medicine works wonders," Morgan replied softly. "Especially if the surgeries were performed by qualified professionals, and judging by these documents, Lauren went to the best doctors." Thomas sat staring at one point, trying to comprehend the new reality. "So Dad found out, that's why That's why. Looks like it," Morgan nodded. "But that doesn't explain why he decided to do something so drastic. Many families face similar situations and find a way to accept reality." The officers continued to look around the apartment, but Morgan already realized that key information had been found. She gave Thomas a few minutes to recover and then gently took the documents away. "We'll need to take this as evidence," she said, "but I'll make copies for you if you'd like." Thomas nodded, his gaze blank. "She should have told me. I would have understood." "Are you sure?" Morgan asked quietly. Thomas looked at her and a spark of anger flashed in his eyes. "Do you think I'm like my father? I loved her. I married her. What does her past matter?" "It matters to some people," Morgan pointed out cautiously. "Perhaps Lauren was afraid of your reaction, or your family's reaction." "She was right about my father," Thomas said bitterly, "but not about me." Leaving Lauren's apartment, Morgan sent the officers with the evidence to the station and drove herself to meet with Elizabeth Harrison. She still had questions after last night's brief conversation, and now knowing the truth about Lauren, she hoped to get a fuller picture. Elizabeth met her at the same house, but looking even more haggard than the day before. Her graying hair was carelessly gathered into a bun, and her eyes were red from crying. "Did you find anything?" she asked, ushering Morgan into the living room. "Yes," the detective replied, taking a seat in a chair. "But before I tell you, I need to ask you some questions about your husband." Elizabeth nodded, nervously adjusting the creases in her dress. "Yesterday you mentioned his obsession with the continuation of the bloodline. Tell me more about it." Elizabeth sighed as if preparing for an unpleasant conversation. "James has always been obsessed with the idea of a dynasty. His father was the same. For them, the Harrison surname is not just a name, it is a legacy that must continue. After Thomas was born, we had complications. I couldn't have any more children." "How did your husband react?" "He was disappointed." "Very." Elizabeth averted her gaze. "But in time he accepted it and shifted all his hopes to Thomas. He began to insist that his son marry early, have a large family. Not just children's sons who would continue the family name. Thomas resisted. He was a good son. Tried to live up to his father's expectations and everything, but in matters of his personal life, he wanted to find true love, not just a suitable candidate to produce heirs." Morgan made a note in her notebook. "Did James interfere with Thomas's relationships with the girls?" Elizabeth paused, then nodded. "Yes, was checking up on them." "In what ways?" "In various ways. Hired people to find out their background, their financial situation, their family history, and in recent years," she stammered. "Please continue," Morgan asked softly. "He insisted that Thomas's girls undergo medical examinations, allegedly to detect genetic diseases that could be passed on to the children. But in reality, he was testing their fertility," Morgan finished for her. "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed quietly. "It was humiliating. Several of Thomas's relationships ended because of it. The girls couldn't handle that kind of pressure. And Lauren? Did she go through that kind of scrutiny too? No, Elizabeth shook her head. Thomas refused. It was the first time he openly went against his father's wishes. Said he loved Lauren and would marry her with or without medical clearance. How did James react? Strange, Elizabeth frowned, remembering. He didn't make a scene like I expected, just kind of withdrew, became brooding. Then suddenly he gave his blessing for the marriage. I was surprised, but happy for Thomas. When did this happen? About 3 months ago. Thomas brought Lauren to a family dinner and announced the engagement. James was tense at first, but then he raised a toast to his future daughter-in-law and gave her the Harrison family brooch. Morgan nodded, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And after that, did you notice anything unusual in your husband's behavior? He started staying late at work more often. Sometimes I'd hear him talking to someone on the phone late at night, locked in his office, but I thought it had to do with business. Elizabeth suddenly fell silent, dawned by a hunch. He hired someone to follow her, didn't he? A private investigator, Morgan confirmed. We found a folder of reports in his office. Oh my God, Elizabeth whispered. And what did he find? Morgan looked at her carefully, assessing whether to tell the truth. Mrs. Harrison, what I'm about to say may be shocking, but it is important to understanding your husband's motives. Elizabeth straightened, preparing to strike. Speak. Lauren was a transgender woman. She was born a man and underwent sex reassignment surgery several years ago. Elizabeth went pale, her hand rising involuntarily to her throat. What? We have medical documentation to prove it, and apparently a private investigator discovered the same thing. And James, Elizabeth stumbled, unable to utter the obvious. We believe he received final confirmation right at the wedding. That message on his phone. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands. He couldn't bear the thought of his only son marrying to a man who could never bear him grandchildren, his precious Harrison heirs. That doesn't justify murder, Morgan said firmly. Of course not, Elizabeth quickly agreed. But I know my husband. For him, the continuation of the lineage is everything. When he found out I couldn't have any more children, he didn't speak to me for a week. And then, he only accepted it because we already had Thomas. Did you know about the gun? No, James never kept a gun in the house. At least that's what I thought. Morgan made a few more marks in her notebook. Where is Thomas now? I don't know. Elizabeth shook her head. He didn't come home after what happened. Won't answer his cell phone. I'm afraid for him. We'll find him, Morgan assured her, rising. Thank you for the conversation, Mrs. Harrison. If you think of anything else, please call me. Leaving the Harrison house, Morgan got into her car and just sat for a while, mulling over the information she had received. The picture was gradually becoming clearer, but that didn't make it any less tragic. A man so obsessed with the idea of procreation that he would rather kill his son's fiancée than let him live with a woman who couldn't bear biological children. Her musings were interrupted by the phone ringing. Detective Morgan, she answered. This is Officer Johnson. We checked with the Southern Investigations Detective Agency. They were hired by James Harrison 3 months ago to investigate Lauren Parker's past. What did they report to him? The initial reports were vague. They found that Lauren had moved to Oak Ridge from out of state, changed her name, but the reasons were unclear. Harrison insisted on continuing the investigation, increased the pay. And they found out the truth, Morgan stated. Yes, but only yesterday. The detective sent the final report with the medical records right around the time of the wedding. Harrison insisted the information was urgent. Thank you, Johnson. Keep looking for Thomas Harrison. He's in shock and could be unpredictable. Finished talking, Morgan started the car. She needed to get back to the station and file her report, but her thoughts kept returning to Thomas. The young man had just lost his wife, learned the shocking truth about her past, and that his father was a cold-blooded killer. At that moment, her phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. Detective Morgan, she answered. This is Thomas Harrison. The voice on the other end sounded cold and determined. I want to talk to my father. In private. The interrogation room at the Oak Ridge police station remained as impersonal as it had been 2 days ago when James Harrison had first been brought here. The same gray walls, the same metal desk, the same dim lighting. But now, Detective Alexa Morgan entered it with a different mood, the confidence of someone who had put together all the pieces of a puzzle. She placed a folder with the logo of Southern Investigations on the desk, Lauren's medical records, and a printout of her phone records beside it. James Harrison sat across the table, still as focused as ever, despite 2 days in the holding cell. Only the shadows under his eyes betrayed his fatigue. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Morgan began, lowering herself into the chair across from him. "Today, we're going to talk about motives." James tilted his head slightly but didn't utter a word. "I know why you killed Lauren," Morgan continued, opening the folder. "And I know that the message you received during the wedding dance was the last report from this detective agency." She unfolded the phone log to him, where the incoming number at 16 hours and 12 minutes stood out. The exact moment Thomas and Lauren had begun their first dance as husband and wife. "This number belongs to Howard Mitchell, the private investigator you hired to follow your son's fiancée. He sent you the final confirmation of what you already suspected. Lauren Parker was born a man." For the first time since his arrest, James's face reflected an emotion, something between fatigue and relief. "I won't discuss it," he uttered, but without the same confidence. "It doesn't matter anymore, Mr. Harrison." Morgan shook her head. "We have all the evidence. We know about your obsession with procreation, the way you forced Thomas's girls to undergo medical fertility tests. We know that Thomas first resisted, refusing to subject Lauren to this humiliating procedure. And we know that instead of respecting your son's decision, you hired a detective to dig into his fiancée's past." James looked at Morgan with a stony expression, but his fingers twitched nervously. "A confession could mitigate the sentence," she added. "The prosecutor can consider effect, temporary impairment of judgment. Otherwise, you face life in prison without parole." "You don't understand," James finally said, his voice sounding muffled. "No one understands. This isn't just a whim. It's a duty. Duty to kill innocent people? Duty to protect the Harrison bloodline." James straightened up as if something inside him had broken, allowing the words to break free. 20 generations, do you understand? 20 generations of pure blood that built this city, this county. And it was all supposed to end in deception? "Lauren didn't cheat anyone," Morgan objected calmly. "She just wanted to live her life." "She tricked my son," James raised his voice for the first time. "Made him believe that she could carry on our line, that she, he stammered as if he couldn't find the words. "That she could bear him children?" Morgan finished for him. "Yes," James exhaled. "Thomas is the only hope. The last Harrison. My father told me, his father told him, the family name must live on. The blood must flow on. It's not just the children, it's the legacy. And for that legacy, you were willing to kill?" "I did what I had to do." James lowered his gaze to his hands. "When I got that message, confirmation that she would never be able to bear Thomas' children, I realized there was no other choice. It was too late to explain anything. They were already married." "You could have let them adopt a child," Morgan remarked. James looked at her with genuine bewilderment. "Alien blood wouldn't continue the Harrison line. You're saying absurd things." Morgan shook her head, amazed at how deeply ingrained in this man were ideas about blood purity and the importance of biological heritage. "Thomas wants to talk to you," she said, changing the subject. "He's waiting outside." A flicker of hope flashed in James's eyes. "Does he understand? Has he forgiven me?" "I don't think so," Morgan answered honestly, "but he wants to hear the truth from you personally." She rose and left the room, leaving James alone with his thoughts. Thomas was waiting for her in the hallway, pale, drained, but determined. "I recorded your conversation with your father," Morgan said as she approached him. "His confession. He explains his motives. Are you sure you want to hear it in person?" "Yes," Thomas nodded. "I must look him in the eye. I will observe through the glass. If you feel you can't handle it, just walk out." Thomas took a deep breath and walked into the interrogation room. James looked up and his face reflected a whole gamut of emotions: hope, fear, love, guilt. "Thomas," he said in a hoarse voice. "Father," Thomas replied coldly, sitting down across from him. "Detective Morgan said you're ready to explain why you killed my wife." James grimaced at the word wife, but nodded. "I wanted to protect you, to protect our family." "From what? From who?" Thomas pitched forward, tension ringing in his voice. "From the woman I loved? Who made me happy?" "She wasn't a woman," James said quietly but firmly, "and she couldn't give you what you needed to continue our kind." "Children?" Thomas grinned bitterly. "Is that all you were thinking of? About hypothetical grandchildren?" "Not about grandchildren, about legacy," James straightened. 20 generations of Harrisons, a pure bloodline. "I know that speech by heart," Thomas interrupted him. "Heard it all my life. Only now do I realize how sick she is." While father and son carried on their difficult conversation, Elizabeth Harrison sat in her bedroom poring over old photographs. One of them showed a young James holding the newborn Thomas in his arms, looking at the infant with an expression of absolute delight and pride. "He really loved you," she whispered, running her finger over the photograph. In his own way. Her musings were interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell. A young police officer stood on the threshold. "Mrs. Harrison, Detective Morgan sent me. She asked me to check your husband's journals that you mentioned during our conversation." Elizabeth frowned. "Diaries? I didn't mention any diaries." "She said that your husband may have kept notes about candidates for your son." Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding. "Not diaries. James never kept diaries, but he had charts, lists. He was always a methodical man." She led the officer into her husband's office, where the police had already searched, but apparently hadn't noticed an inconspicuous folder in the bookcase labeled simply "Personal." "Here," Elizabeth pulled it out and handed it to the officer. "I've never looked inside. James wouldn't approve." The officer opened the folder and whistled. Inside were neatly organized spreadsheets with the names of every girl Thomas had ever dated, their ages, physical characteristics, family history, and most strikingly, an estimate of their reproductive potential. "Some kind of eugenics project," the officer muttered. "He's always been obsessed with the ideal," Elizabeth said quietly. "At first I thought it was just high standards, then that it was an oddity. Only now do I realize it was madness." She sank into her husband's chair, suddenly feeling the weight of years lived under the weight of this obsession. "You know, after Thomas was born, I had complications. The doctors said I couldn't have any more children. James changed that day. It was like a part of him died. He became cold. He started to talk about Thomas not as a son, but as carrying on the line. His whole upbringing was centered around this idea of raising the perfect heir, who would in turn produce more Harrisons." The officer shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, not knowing how to respond to this confession. "I need to take this to Detective Morgan," he finally said. Elizabeth nodded. "Of course. Maybe it will help him understand. We'll help Thomas understand." In the interrogation room, meanwhile, the conversation was becoming increasingly tense. "Did you know that Lauren loved children?" Thomas said, looking his father in the eye. "We discussed adoption. She worked at the library and led children's readings every Saturday. The children adored her. She would have made a wonderful mother." "Not a mother, an adoptive parent," James objected stubbornly. "It's not the same thing." "It's the same thing to me," Thomas said firmly. "You know, I realized something after Lauren died. The real legacy isn't in the DNA, it isn't in the family name. It's in the love we give, in the lives we touch." James looked at his son with the expression of a man who doesn't understand a foreign language. "I'm still going to be a father," Thomas continued. "I'll adopt a child, maybe even several. Give them our last name, and they'll be Harrisons no less than you and me." "That's impossible." James shook his head. "Blood." "To hell with the blood!" Thomas pounded his fist on the table. "You killed a man because of your obsession with purity of line. A man I loved. You ruined my life for some sick idea of dynasty." "I was protecting our heritage," James repeated stubbornly. "Someday you'll understand." "Never." Thomas rose, his face contorted with anger and pain. "I will never understand or forgive you. You are no longer my father, and I swear I will raise my children with completely different values, love, acceptance, respect for others. That legacy you so desperately defended will die with you. He turned to leave, but James called out to him, "You can't give up your blood, Thomas. You are Harrison. It's in your veins." Thomas stopped in the doorway and, without turning around, said, "Perhaps, but it's up to me to decide what that means." Detective Morgan was waiting for him in the hallway. She had seen the conversation through the one-way mirror and now watched Thomas's condition anxiously. "Are you all right?" she asked. "No," he answered honestly, "and I don't think I ever will be, but I know what I have to do next." At that moment, an officer approached them with a folder found in the Harrison house. "Detective Morgan, you might want to take a look at this." Morgan flipped through the documents and her face darkened. "He's systematized information on all your girls, assessed their reproductive potential. It even has calculations of the likelihood of conceiving boys." Thomas shook his head, strangely calm after all he'd been through. "It doesn't surprise me anymore. I've lived next to this madness all my life, but never noticed its true extent." 3 months later, the county's courtroom was packed. James Harrison's case attracted not only local attention, but also national media attention. The story of a millionaire who killed his son's fiancée because of her transgender past and obsession with procreation resonated across the country. James sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed, but visibly aged. Next to him was an expensive lawyer specializing in murder cases. Thomas sat in the front row next to his mother. Elizabeth looked frail but determined. After her husband's arrest, she had filed for divorce and started therapy, trying to deal with years of emotional abuse. When the judge read the sentence, life in prison without parole, James showed no emotion. He only turned to take one last look at his son, but Thomas was already getting up to leave. "I did everything for you, for our family," James uttered as the convoy prepared to lead him away. Thomas stopped, but didn't turn around. "No, Father. Everything you've done for the sake of your obsession. My family is just beginning." Detective Morgan watched the scene from the back rows of the courtroom. The case was over. Justice, as far as possible, had been served. But as is often the case in her work, it was not satisfying. Too many lives had been ruined. 2 weeks after the trial, Morgan received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a picture of Thomas holding a little girl with Asian features and a short note. "Meet Lauren Harrison, my daughter. A new chapter begins." She smiled as she looked at the picture. There was a glow of life in Thomas's eyes, despite everything he'd been through. Maybe the real legacy really isn't in the blood, but in the love we choose to give. In a maximum security prison 300 miles from Oak Ridge, James Harrison sat in his cell, staring at a blank wall. The voices of his ancestors still echoed in his head, speaking of the importance of blood, of duty to the family name, of 20 generations of pure lineage. But sometimes, in rare moments of clarity, another voice would break through that chorus, his own, remembering little Thomas, his first steps, his laughter. And then James wondered if he had paid too high a price for his obsession, hadn't sacrificed what really mattered for the phantom idea of a legacy. But these moments were rare and passed quickly. As the judge said at the trial, "Some beliefs are so deeply ingrained that they become a prison before a person even gets behind bars." In Oak Ridge, life went on. The Harrison construction empire was headed by Elizabeth, showing unexpected business acumen. Thomas returned to work as an architect, but now was engaged in the design of children's institutions, and in his house grew up little Lauren, a girl with different blood, but with the same last name, living proof that a real family is defined not by genes but by love. Detective Alexa Morgan sometimes met them in the city, father and daughter walking in the park or picking out books at the very library where the first Lauren had once worked. And each time, she thought about the strange paths fate takes people down, the destructive power of obsession and the ability of the human heart to heal and start over. There was no happy ending in the Harrison story, too much pain, too much loss, but there was a new beginning. And maybe that's the best we can hope for after tragedy, a chance to write the next chapter differently.